What's up, Mr. Piland's U.S. History students? This is March 31st, and I'm going through the PowerPoint that I assigned on Monday, March 30th. I'm going to do the origins of slavery, from slavery to freedom for the United States for Black Americans in the United States. I'm going to go through it real quick and dirty and try not to bore you with too many details. But again, this is something that's going to be quizzed on, so if there's anything extra important, hint, hint, wink, wink, I'll let you know. We're concentrating on the first two objectives of the unit. Objective number one being the reasons for intolerance of certain groups of people, African Americans, in the United States. And then what are some of the methods that United States citizens and other people in government have tried to use to change people's minds about African Americans and certain types of people in the United States. So again, from slavery to freedom, origins of slavery. How did it all begin? The United States, when it first became an agrarian society, which meant that people can plant things and grow things, they realized they needed a lot of help. They tried to make slaves out of the Native Americans that were already here, but they found out that the Native Americans weren't very good at being slaves. They were very defiant. They were nomadic people. In other words, they roamed around. They didn't like to stay in one place very long. So they went back to the old school. In world studies, you learned about the Columbian Exchange, which is New World goods went to the Old World. Old World goods came back to the New World. And another partner in that trading venture was West Africa. West Africa had been collecting slaves and using captives from different wars as slaves for thousands of years. It was something that was built into their societies to begin with, so it made more sense to bring them over as slaves. So African Americans started showing up in the Americas in the late 1400s, early 1500s, and then in the United States are closer to 1600s, and that's how it started. In defense of slavery, many people at this point actually tried to defend the institution of slavery, saying it wasn't that bad. Some things that they said about it was that, obviously the South depended on slave labor. So if you take that away, you'll be taking away everybody's livelihood that lives and works on a farm in the South. A very common argument. If you freed the slaves, hundreds of thousands of African Americans that were captive, now all of a sudden free, that wouldn't be very good for the country. It would cause chaos, and we didn't want that. Last but not least, a lot of people said that, hey man, compared to the way that some people live in poverty in other nations like Europe, slavery is not such a bad institution at all. They're well fed, well taken care of, all that kind of good stuff. So that is in defense of slavery. Northerners, on the other hand, did not have a very agrarian society. They had more businesses and factories and things like that. They didn't necessarily need slave labor in the North because their system of economics worked very differently. They had, like I said, factories. People who did not support slavery were called abolitionists. They wanted to abolish or end slavery. They argued that slavery was not a natural thing. People should not be forced into serving other people. Some of the more famous anti-slave supporters, abolitionists were Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, others like that. He fought tirelessly to end slavery. There's a link here on this page that you can see here. You guys can go through this yourselves. I'm not going to go to every link on here, but there are some links that you can follow to other websites as well. Abolitionists used a variety of tactics to end slavery. They had the Underground Railroad that they used to actually abduct slaves from slaveholding sites and get them all the way to the north without being caught. There were lots of people along the way and buildings along the way with hidden areas of the buildings where you could hide for a while from people who might be looking for runaway slaves. Different people that wrote literature, like Uncle Tom's Cabin was a very popular book that exposed slavery and all the evilness of what it had. And then there were also slave revolts where slaves would actually en masse revolt against their owners and kill people to protest their slavery. We had northern states, we had free states, and as the United States progressed and got more territory out west, northern and southern Congress members, people in Congress, fought to get those territories named either slave-holding states or non-slave states. And it was a big battle throughout Congress at the time of the American expansion, which also was at the time of the Civil War. One of the key decisions in the slave-holding in history was the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a slave who was moved to a free territory. He was in a slave-holding state, he was a slave, and then his owner moved to a free state. So he actually sued and took his owner to court, claiming that since he's now in a free state, he should be able to be a free man. Well, the Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott did not have a legal standing to sue in court because he wasn't a citizen of the United States. As weird as it may sound, as ugly as it may be, Dred Scott had about as much right as a horse or cattle. He was property and nothing else, not a citizen of the United States. So being in a free territory, according to the Supreme Court, did not make a slave free. So once again, they had no rights to speak of. During the election of 1860, the president that was elected was Abraham Lincoln. He had no votes from any southern states whatsoever because southern states believed he would, and rightfully so, they believed he would remove slavery from the United States. Before he had a chance to do that, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and other states followed South Carolina. So what happened was, a real civil war is where two sides fight over the same thing. Like if two sides were fighting over Washington, D.C., that would be a civil war. But this was kind of different. What the South did was they actually seceded. They just said, we're going to leave the Union. We're going to leave the United States. We're going to make the Southern States of America. They didn't want anything to do with President Lincoln or the United States anymore. So President Lincoln decided that it was the most important thing that he actually go to war in order to preserve the United States of America. Make the South come back to the Union and make the Union, or Washington, D.C., the only place that was the capital of the United States. While the Southern states seceded from the Union, they made Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Southern States of America. They had their own president. They had their own, their own government. So they literally just said, "We're leaving the United States." That's how it all started, anyway. So the Civil War actually begins, and the Northerners felt that secession was unconstitutional and weakened the U.S. They needed the United States to be many states together, not just the northern states. They felt that that made them weaker and not as strong. So the northern men fought to preserve the Union, not necessarily for equality of all people at first. Black men in the North were not allowed to fight on the northern side at first. For the South, the Southerners, it was more a way of preserving their way of life. They did not feel that Washington, D.C. and the United States of America represented them very well anymore. They didn't all own slaves. As a matter of fact, a very small percentage of people in the South actually owned slaves. Although the economics of the South really did depend on slave labor. So even though the Civil War was not defined as a fight for and against slavery at first, it would soon take a turn towards that in the coming months. When did that happen? It happened because of the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. It was issued September 22nd, 1862. What it did was it freed the slaves in the states that were rebelling against the United States. In other words, it said anybody who is a slave in the southern states of the United States is a free man. Now, you can imagine this didn't do much good because nobody in the South was actually going to listen to a proclamation from the Northern President, Abraham Lincoln, because the South had seceded from the North. They had their own government. As the Union won different battles, though, in the United States, they could actually go into those states, conquer those states, and then tell the slaves in those states, you are now free. So as they built momentum and gained a little bit more territory in the war and fought in the southern states, the Union Army would actually free those slaves as they conquered the territory. What did the Emancipation Proclamation do? Well, really what it did was it defined the Civil War. The Civil War was actually now a war about freeing slaves. Slave owners versus non-slave owners. Slave states versus non-slave states. When this thing was made, it finally defined the war as a war for or against slavery. And that was in 1863, 3 years after, or actually 2 years after they started fighting the war. So what is the Union, this famous quote by a Union officer says, "We were no longer the soldiers of a political controversy. We were now the missionaries of a great work of redemption, the armed liberators of millions." That's a Union officer saying, now we have a purpose for why we're fighting. We are going to free all of the slaves. We're going to free all of the non-freed people of the United States. So after the South finally lost the war in 1865, Southern states rejoined the Union. When that happened, they had to adhere to certain guidelines set forth by the Union itself. So they said, you can come back to the Union, and you will come back to the Union, but first you need to do a few things. So rights of African Americans were reinstated in all southern states. They needed to prove to the North that they actually recovered from this and actually are including African Americans in their recovery. Establish jobs for free slaves, allow slaves to run for political office, provide education and medicine for freed slaves. And then, of course, as usual with everything that happens in the United States, and there's a couple of links in here where you can dive further down the rabbit hole, and I suggest you do, it wasn't perfect. The system did not exactly work the way it's supposed to do. At this point, if everything worked perfectly, black men and women would be completely free. Free to vote, free to run for office, free to do whatever they chose, and of course become a little bit more like the rest of America. But as we know from studying history, it took many years after that, and some say we still haven't quite done enough to establish African Americans as regular and regular citizens with equal rights amongst everybody else. It would take some time after that. So what did they do right away? In the federal government, they passed 3 amendments almost immediately. 13th Amendment was the first one, banning slavery. In the Constitution, the 13th Amendment of the Constitution says, neither slavery nor indentured servitude shall exist. Boom, slavery was over. The Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery in the southern states, supposedly, but it still wasn't an amendment. It wasn't in the Constitution, so that's why they had to add it to that. Then you got the 14th Amendment of the Constitution in 1868, a few years after that, called the Citizenship Clause. It redefines what a citizen of the United States is. Born in the U.S. equals citizen. So now we've got the Dred Scott decision coming back to us again. Dred Scott was not able to prove himself a free man because he was not a citizen of the United States. He was a slave. And so now it gives rights to slaves, saying you are a citizen, therefore they can do things like vote for political office or sue somebody if they feel like their rights are being violated. Citizens of the United States have all the rights of other citizens under the law of the United States. Equal protection under the law. Each state must provide equal protection under the law to all people within their jurisdiction. it prevented states from denying rights to U.S. citizens just because they were once a slave and now free. And finally, the 15th Amendment, they had to establish that all black men had the right to vote in this country. Only, let's see, as of the election of 1868, only 800,000 African Americans were registered to vote. And many southern states started to do things like have a literacy test and poll taxes and things that prevented black men from actually voting in southern states. According to the population of those states, you can understand why a lot of southern states were afraid of black men voting. There were some southern states that had literally hundreds of thousands of newly freed black citizens that could potentially vote, which could really affect how the country was developed or how the states were developed as far as the government leaders that were elected. So they had to figure that one out, and at first a lot of things were done to keep black men away from the polling place. However, the 15th Amendment said no one can be kept from voting based on race or color. But of course, as U.S. history students, you know it didn't necessarily work out perfectly right away. So life after slavery was not great for many African Americans. Many of them were unable to escape the life of poverty on the land and attached to the land of, of the same farmers that they were once enslaved to. It wasn't as simple as you're free now you're going to be successful. They were left with no education, no land, no skills, no money. They moved to cities and towns to seek education and jobs. They began to hold some government offices. They were promised 40 acres of their own and a mule by the government of the United States. This never happened, and is once again a topic of contention amongst a lot of Americans these days. It was an unkept promise by the American government. So many of them turned to sharecropping in order to provide for their families, which was a system, according to this, by which African Americans are allowed to farm somebody else's land for a portion of the